This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Peter Hennessy. I have the great pleasure of chairing the apostolic session. I shall be between Peter and Paul. And a lot of ground can be covered between Peter and Paul. Peter has been a friend and a mentor of mine for longer than I care to remember. I was a young journalist on the Times long ago and far away when it was still a quality newspaper, and I used to publish things that irritated him occasionally, but he always forgave me. And Paul and I share in a different way what I think David Cannadine once called a late imperial childhood. But there's one addition, I think, to Peter's CV, which we need to remember, which he was High Commissioner in Australia in 1956. So you can bear that in mind as well. And Peter, would you like to go first? Would you like the podium or to sit down? Absolutely. Right.
All of you know so much more about the legacy of the Commonwealth and Empire than I do, and you've heard something of it this afternoon. I thought, if I may, I would make a few reflections about the countries in the Commonwealth in which I've been involved over the years, which perhaps leads to the idea that there was a legacy as a result of our involvement in those countries. And I remember my first thought about the Commonwealth was when I was a young soldier in 1939, and I found that as soon as we declared war, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, all within the space of a very short time, declared war too. And reflecting in 2013, it is a remarkable thing that they did. After all, they could very well have made the same sort of excuses, the same sort of explanation that the Americans made about their not being involved in the war in 1939. They were miles away from the scene of action, and their own interests were not involved. And yet, those three countries came absolutely straight away to our aid, to English, British, United Kingdom aid at that time. Would they do it now? Yes, I think so, but I think it would take longer. But I think it would, in the end, happen. My first real contact with the Commonwealth was, as Peter said, when I was appointed High Commissioner in Australia. And it was, for me, a very extraordinary appointment because I'd never been to Australia. I knew absolutely nothing about diplomacy and protocol. And rather mistakenly, I thought it was going to be very easy. I thought that since they played cricket and they drank tea and they spoke English, it would merely be like moving from London to York. And all would be well, but it wasn't really like that at all. I was living from the very first in what was a very friendly but a foreign country. And what I think was so good about it was that, I mean, you all know this, that I don't think you really know your own country until you live abroad, because you get a different perspective and you learn about what other people think about the things that you take for granted and were thought to be excellent. And the interesting thing about Australia at that time was that it had been, until then, a totally pastoral country. And all of a sudden, it changed while I was there. First of all, it changed because the Australians realized that the Americans were the people who really mattered, the country that really mattered to them in the Pacific Ocean. The Battle of the Coral Sea had saved Australia from invasion by the Japanese, and they realized only too well that the balance of power has shifted between what we in the pre-war days thought of as the supremacy of the British to the supremacy of the United States. And that made a difference to their perception of us. And of course, what really made a difference to them was the discovery of minerals. And curiously enough, having exploited the minerals, and particularly trading with Japan, that didn't stop them being extremely irritated with us for the idea of joining the common market, although for exactly the same reason that they were trading with Japan. So it was a fascinating time. But above all, they began to realize for the first time that they lived in the Pacific. They were surrounded by countries which were not at all like them, except for New Zealand, and that they had better adjust themselves to the idea that they were a Southeast Asian country rather than a country that lived in the North Sea. And Dick Casey, the foreign minister, was a very great advocate of this. His problem was, and is to this day, that though they may realize they live in the Southeast Pacific region, the countries of the Southeast Pacific region don't recognize that they are really part of them, and so they are still in a difficulty. But as for their relations with us, I think that they've settled down very well. I think that they've kept the essentials of their British inheritance, and I don't think, frankly, that they've done too badly. If I ever get turned out of this country, I shall go and live in Australia. And I was lucky enough at that time, having been a junior minister, to be allowed to go and do various things for the government in Malaya and Singapore. And that, to me, was fascinating because, if you remember, probably you're all too young, but in point of fact, Duncan Sandys was the Commonwealth Secretary. And Duncan Sandys was very much in favour of federations. And he wanted a federation of Malaya and Singapore, and which was perfectly logical. But the thing about a federation is that there's not much point in having one if the people concerned don't want it. And there's no doubt that the Malays, and in particular Tunku Abdul Rahman, didn't want it at all, because though he was a wise and wily man, he thought that Lee Kuan Yew was a good deal cleverer than him, which indeed he was. And that the result would be that the Malays would be a poor second to the Chinese in Singapore. And very wisely, I think, we decided that the right thing to do was to abandon the idea of the federation. And both countries, as a result, have prospered exceedingly. I was surprised, though, in those days that the Colonial Office to start with, and then the Commonwealth Relations Office, totally misunderstood Lee Kuan Yew. They thought he was a really dangerous communist, and that if he became Chief Minister of Singapore, the whole of the Southeast Asian, British side of the Southeast Asian would collapse because this extreme communist would take over. Well, all as Lord Hailsham of St Albans used to say, ho bloody ho. Anyway, I think we were sensible enough to deal with that. And after all, afterwards, we behaved rather well with the communist uprising in Malaysia and our attitude, our military actions against Sukarno. And so I don't think we've anything much to be ashamed about what happened in Malaysia and Singapore. I did happen to go to a lunch party to celebrate Merdeka in Kuala Lumpur. And I was astonished. We had the menu was supposed to be from all the countries that had been involved in Malaya over the years. So we had, shark's fin soup and curry and so on. And the British contribution to this feast was splendidly enough something which I wouldn't conceivably have thought to be British. It was a sort of what are those things called, which are really French. Anyway, it had a French name, and there was no. I wondered if that was the only contribution we'd made in the Malaya over the years. It had been singularly unsuccessful. India and Pakistan, I would pass over as far as I'm concerned, because I'm not qualified to judge whether or not we were premature in giving independence to India. And anyway, it's far too late to talk about it. I do worry, though, and India's prospered exceedingly, but do I worry about Pakistan? Yes, of course I do. And if I'm in my gloomiest moods, I would say, whether we're right or wrong, or the legacy they've got from us, it's going to be a very dangerous part of the world, with Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Israeli and Middle East competition. We're going to have a lot of trouble in that part of the world, and I'm afraid Pakistan is probably going to be part of it. And then we come to Africa, which I think is infinitely more difficult, both East and West Africa. And partly our difficulties in decolonization, which on the whole has gone very well, was where there were countries in which there were British settlers. And British settlers who, understandably enough, took the best land. And those in Kenya and Rhodesia and so on were the difficult decolonizations. And of course it's varied so much between East Africa and West Africa, and between the countries in those areas, as to whether or not they've been successful and what legacies we have left them. Some have been very successful, but one of the problems of the Commonwealth over the past years has been the difficulties in Africa, as you will know better than me. After all, Choggums have been ruined by, first of all, South Africa, arms to South Africa, and what have you, and then subsequently by the problems of Rhodesia. And I think it's all settled now. I think that we've forgotten that from the point of view of the problems of the Commonwealth. But I have no doubt that if we had not got a settlement in Rhodesia, however you may view the outcome, there really would have been trouble in the Commonwealth. I think there would have been real danger of the Commonwealth either breaking up or being fragmented by the feeling in the Commonwealth that we had not been very clever in our dealings with the Rhodesian problem. One of the lessons from the Rhodesian problem, it seems to me, is that you really can't solve a problem unless all the people concerned, all the individual countries, the parties concerned, want a settlement. I mean, for example, if you take Israel and the Palestinians at the moment, there may be people on both sides that want a settlement, but no leader of either of those two countries could possibly persuade their own people to accept something which is even faintly possible for the other side to accept. And until everybody wants a settlement, it's really very difficult to see how you could ever get one. Luckily, at that time in Rhodesia, for one reason or another, everybody wanted a settlement. Of course, they didn't want the settlement that happened necessarily, but they wanted a settlement. And then when they were embarked on the conference, it was very difficult for them to get out. And the other thing about that particular period was that some people somehow don't seem to understand that if you have an election which is free and you don't like the result, you have to stick by it. You know, to me, it was perfectly obvious that Mugabe was going to win because the Shona are the biggest tribe in Rhodesia, in Zimbabwe. But a lot of people wanted us not to recognise that election, and that, I think, would have been disastrous. I must tell you, I probably oughtn't tell you the story, but after we decided to have an election and everybody had agreed, President Nyerere said to me, I want you to know that unless Mugabe wins the election, I shall not recognise it. So I said, oh. And when the election was over and the independence in Salisbury, Nyerere didn't come to the celebration. She sent his foreign minister. And even somebody so clever as Nyerere doesn't seem really to have understood us. The foreign minister said to me, he said, President Nyerere sends his compliments, but he wants to know why you made Mugabe win by so much. And so it's certainly a lesson. I've gone on too long. But let me just end up. All this, I think, there is an indication from everything I've said that there is a legacy. And one of the things that I found most cheerful, I mean, other than the obvious things that we talk about, the rule of law and our bequeathing the Westminster Constitution to all our colonies, which they got rid of as fast as they possibly could, with the possible exception of India, which is most unlikely. But the real thing that's come out of that, for us the British, is that all those countries are part of the Commonwealth and they're friends. And they're friends because, on the whole, we haven't done too badly.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. All yours, Paul.
My lords, Sir Ronald, and as I learned to say during my stint in South Africa, all the feathers of the eagle. Isn't that a wonderful expression? And of course, it emanates from that old African saying that it's each and every feather that makes the eagle soar. It's each and every feather that makes the eagle soar. And of course, when I think about under whose auspices we are gathered today, the Overseas Service Pensioners Association, it's all of the members of that association, each and every one of you, in your different ways, with your different roles, different shapes, sizes and colors. It's each and every one of you that made the colonial experience, the experience of empire, what it was. And for that, much thanks, because I think we're here today really just to give our personal reflections, and I'll give mine. I don't intend to attempt a treatise on the pros and cons of empire. An old boss of mine used to say, and I think Peter knows of whom I speak, we are where we are. And we are where we are when it comes to empire, and I in the main think that we could be in a far worse place, and that there are many other places that are in a worse place than we are when we reflect on the legacy of empire. And of course, to a certain extent, we are living that legacy. London wouldn't be London, Birmingham wouldn't be Birmingham, Manchester wouldn't be Manchester, Cardiff, or indeed Swansea. And those of you who are from Wales know there's a big difference between Cardiff and Swansea, except that I didn't know in my course of a recent visit there until I actually popped into the museum that there was a time when Swansea was the centre of the copper industry of the world. Did you know that? No. And yet if you go there, you find why. And Swansea is what it is, and its prosperity was based on the fact that it was where the copper of the empire was marketed. And the demography, the ease, the comfort with which the world finds when it's in London, the ease and comfort with which people coexist, the ease and comfort which this country has with its diversity, which is for Britain at this time such a unique selling point, which makes it the attractive place that it is for business and for residents, which is why our property prices in London are so high, is because in the course of that experience, that imperial experience, that experience of colonialism and its ending, and the way it ended, and I want to say one or two things about that in the course of this afternoon. It's the nature of that experience that has created the comfort zone that Britain has with the rest of the world, and importantly, I would argue, the comfort that the rest of the world has with Britain. And when I think about my own life's experience, in many ways, because at the end of the day and at the beginning, I am the grandson of a cocoa farmer from Achim in eastern Ghana, and a printer from Hoxton in East London. So in the way, I am the embodiment of empire and the legacy of empire, and I'm pretty comfortable in my own skin and with that. And there is a reason for that, I would argue, is that when you look at the colonial experience, whether from London or from Ghana, and I'm going to talk mainly about Ghana, though I'll reflect a bit on my experience in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa, and I spend about a third of my time now in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. When you look at that experience, you find, certainly in the case of my father's generation, that although he was a stalwart in the fight against colonialism, a lawyer, trained at King's down the road, and at Gray's Inn, although he was a stalwart in the fight against colonialism, he always gave credit for the plus, as well as obviously combating the downside, which was the loss of sovereignty. Although in the case of Ghana, and the Gold Coast before it, it's quite important to remember historically that actually the British colonial experience in relation to the whole of what is modern-day Ghana was relatively brief. The last king of the Ashantis to take up arms against Britain was exiled in what, 1903? Britain was out by 57. 54 years, nothing. Prior to that, there had been a relationship between different tribes and different peoples in what is now modern-day Ghana, with the Portuguese, with the Danes, with the Dutch, with the Germans. My paternal grandfather never spoke any English, but he did speak German. Why? Because his father had sent him to be educated by the Basel missionaries in what was German Togoland, which of course eventually became, through the trust and mandate process, British and French Togoland. And so the actual experience of the Gold Coast Ghana with Britain was relatively short. And I would just like to focus on one or two aspects of that experience through the life of someone who I think was one of the greatest of administrators of empire, Gordon Guggisberg. And Guggisberg is a very interesting case study. He was someone who didn't fit in the usual imperial mode. He was Jewish in his origins, although converted to Christianity. He was someone who, long before it was actually fashionable, saw the experience of empire as being one that was not designed to hold people in a state of servitude, but rather to lift them up. He had a profound sense of responsibility to the people in which countries he was sent. And I would argue that he was by no means alone in that, and that indeed, so far as the Gold Coast was concerned, certainly, and I don't think it was confined to the Gold Coast, there were many whose primary concern was to do the best job possible in very often quite difficult and challenging circumstances. Circumstances made no less difficult or challenging by some of the stuff that was sent them from home, one way or the other. And anyone that served in the diplomatic service or the colonial service knows how you have to deal with the commands that come from home, and knows the grief that they can bring. And indeed, Lord Carrington touched on some of that in the course of his reflections this afternoon. And Guggisberg's legacy, so far as Ghana was concerned, was one that can be measured in terms of schools, roads, infrastructure, and an emphasis on public administration and the importance of public administration, with the maximum involvement of the native indigenous people. And it's a legacy that exists in Ghana to this day. To this day, every year in Ghana, there's given the Guggisberg Fraser Aggrey Memorial Lectures, linking the names of 3 people who were and remain for modern-day Ghana the embodiment of what one ought to seek in terms of administration, vision, and values. Aggrey, the great African educator who was a trustee of an American foundation promoting the education of women, blacks, and the deserving working class, just a different age. But that was the purposes of the trust, and he traveled all over Africa, all over the world, talking about the importance of educating young women in native indigenous peoples and the working class, and excellence through education. Fraser, the Scottish theologian and educator, Guggisberg, the enlightened colonial governor. And that emphasis on infrastructure and on education and on ensuring the maximum participation of the colonial peoples led to Ghana's being the first country to obtain, sub-Saharan African country, to obtain its independence. So for Ghana, the legacy of empire is still to be found, alive and well and delivering. And indeed, the challenge, and I do think it's important when we reflect on the legacy of empire, it shouldn't be because we want to engage in some sort of soft, sentimental sojourn. The past is another country. but our human condition, our frailties, our fads, our foibles, our strengths and our weaknesses remain the same. And I think it is through this study, seeing it whole, seeing it clear, of the imperial and colonial experience, that we can get a good sense of some of the challenges and how we should be coping with some of the challenges that we face today. And as we get into the sort of what I hope will be the discussion stage of this afternoon, let me just identify three of them for you. The first is and remains the challenge for Africa of infrastructure. The fact of the matter is that the World Bank in the late 70s and 80s, well into the 90s, and indeed it only began to change with the Africa Commission leading up to Gleneagles in 2005, the World Bank had a downer on infrastructure. So the result was that the road and rail network, that was one of the strongest and greatest gifts and legacies of empire in so many parts of Africa, degraded. So whilst in India it was maintained and led to the promotion of economic growth on the subcontinent, made a real contribution in that regard, the great railways of Africa were either allowed to fall into neglect as a result of post-colonial incompetence and the operation of the road lobby, which in every country globally is a strong one and constantly works against rail, or was a subject, as it was in southern Africa, of Cold War and South African battles that led to the railway network being broken up. But that emphasis on road and rail in particular, which was driven by the colonial experience, made a very significant contribution to economic growth in the then colonies. I give you this example from my own family's experience when I was a child growing up, and when my father was sent to King's. He was sent to King's on the back of a medium-sized cocoa farm in the Achim region of the Gold Coast. That cocoa farm produced high-quality cocoa beans because it was immediately adjacent to the West African Cocoa Research Institute. Immediately adjacent because, in fact, the colonial government had seized my grandmother's land in order to build the West African Cocoa Research Institute, something for which we have never received compensation. I don't seek to make a claim now, but it is a fact. Now, what was significant was, one, the fact that there was a West African Cocoa Research Institute, because it was a regional regional facility, and two, that there was a direct rail link between the cocoa farm and Takoradi Harbour. So it could be, the cocoa could be exported directly and at much lower cost than it can be today. Because today, higher education across the continent has been underinvested in, an 85% per capita cut in the amount of money spent on higher education in the last 20 years because of donors' focus on primary education. At 85% cut, so the Cocoa Research Institute is no longer what it was, and there's no longer that direct rail link. So I would argue that when we reflect on empire and its consequence, we need to learn some of the positive lessons that are to be obtained from that period. The third particular area that I wanted really to reflect on was in the area of public administration and governance. Again, something that Gugisberg focused on in his early work in terms of establishing a legislative council in the Gold Coast that began to represent a growing and aspirant African middle class at the same time, and this has been one of the challenges of the post-imperial experience, at the same time as recognizing that you couldn't make a simple transplant of Westminster-style democracy into Africa, that was never going to work because of the complex web of loyalties around tribe, around clan, and ethnic and linguistic groups that make up the reality of the African experience. And to simply substitute a winner-takes-all, first by the post, Westminster-style democracy, and seek to overlay that on top of that complex web was never actually going to work. And indeed, it hasn't worked. And what has happened has been, and overall, the story is much better now than it was 20 years ago, is that new forms of constitutional dispensation have had to be developed that recognize the continuing power and influence of the chieftaincy, and also, and importantly, seek to deal with that overwhelmingly negative aspect of empire, namely that in the course of the Treaty of Berlin, lines were drawn across Africa that didn't bear any resemblance at all to the loyalties, to the tribal, to the ethnic and linguistic boundaries that already existed on the continent. And the classic example of that is modern-day Somalia and Somaliland, when you have a territory that was the subject of colonial powers from Italy, from France, and from the United Kingdom, with Somali peoples finding themselves in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, in Kenya, as well as in the heart of Somalia and Somaliland, and a clan system that modern-day Somaliland, which is an effective operating democracy, as opposed to Somalia, a clan system that their parliamentary arrangements have had to accommodate. And it's fascinating to visit Hargeisa, as I have over the past 2 or 3 years on a number of occasions, and see the way their new parliamentary dispensation, their upper house, the House of Elders, the Gerti, and their National Assembly have sought to adapt themselves and adapt their ways of operating to a clan system that always sought consensus and endless dialogue and discussion.
Paul, I'm conscious of the questions.
Endless dialogue and discussion rather than the cut and thrust of the Westminster approach. So a complex and mixed picture, but at the end of the day, a sense that there is a legacy in which we can take pride and a degree of satisfaction about not just the manner of its exit, but also some of what was left behind. So for that, I say in my father's and grandfather's tongue, Medasi, Medasi Papa. That means thank you. Thank you very much. Lovely.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Peter. Can I see some hands for questions? Yes, front row. Could you stand up? Thank you. Do stand up. Oh, it's coming, isn't it? The machine. Microphone, even.
Jonathan Lawley, ex-Northern Rhodesia administration and British election supervisor in the Southern Rhodesia independence elections in 1980. I'm immensely proud to have been in the British colonial service. But you know, from the point of view of us on the ground, we were faced with things like the Federation or an accelerated program towards independence, which was not easy. Doing the training, preparing for independence, which came within 2 or 3 years, and we were expecting perhaps 15 or 20. It was not easy, but it was a great challenge. And my question is really, why is it that we were not understood by the media, we weren't given the understanding by the media or by many academics, and it went across to the public as if we were somehow politically incorrect. Colonialism became a sort of dirty word, and we didn't get the sort of recognition for the immense achievements of bringing these countries into the modern world, into the Commonwealth. And that, I think, is one of the great preoccupations of many of the people here in this room. And I just wondered if you had any comments.
Thank you, Peter. You were in the cabinet for part of the decolonisation period. Would you like to answer the question?
If I'd been in the colonial service, I'd have been very proud of it. I think it was splendid, and I know so many people who are. As for why you're not recognised as such, I think it's bad education, bad teachers, and stupidity.
Peter, I think from deep recollection, you said a long time ago now that about the British Empire that nothing became the Brits like the leaving of it. Do you still feel that?
I think we did more. I think the British Empire was splendid.
Let's have a group of them and then we'll come back.
Okay, yes. Yes, here, please, and then we'll go work down.
Harry Mitchell, I was in Sierra Leone and later spent some years in India. I'd like to follow up with what the previous questioner said about lack of understanding on the part of the media. That hasn't gone away. In the last 12 months, I've had a particular battle with the BBC, notoriously left-wing ideology influence. Some of you may have seen a programme which was broadcast last August about Livingstone, presented by Professor Neil Oliver. And it was a very good programme. It was well researched, well presented, but at the end, Neil Oliver indulged in some wholly gratuitous remarks, saying that following Livingstone's death, there was the scramble for Africa, which was almost as bad as the slave trade. And I felt greatly incensed by this. I wrote to the BBC and complained about it. They just didn't accept my complaint. I was given the right to appeal to the BBC Trust, which has its own separate complaints system. They similarly dismissed it. No understanding whatsoever on the part of the boffins of the BBC of the values and the history of the British Empire.
Thank you very much.
Paul. I mean, I think one of the things that we wrestle with is that increasingly in these times, people find it very hard to cope with ambiguity and complexity. And they literally haven't got the language for it. And if you want to avoid having to deal with the complexities and the ambiguities of empire, then you do take a particular position. And the easiest position to take is one that finds it very hard to recognize any good at all in the colonial experience, one that finds it very hard to recognize, as is recognized when you actually talk to people in the West Indies, in Africa, in Asia. They recognize, because they know from their own experience, the quality of some of the people they had to deal with, just as they'll be equally frank about the downside. Just as Gugisberg, for instance, had to cope with real objections coming from some quarters to the fact that he appointed the first black person as a medical officer at Kolebu Hospital. There was racism, there was bigotry, and if you're not prepared to examine complexity and ambiguity, and if you haven't got the language for it, then you take the easy route. And the slave trade's a classic example. When people talk about the slave trade, they tend to focus much more, if not exclusively, on the Atlantic slave trade. So it all becomes a matter of black and white. They forget that the Arab slave trade went on much longer and indeed shaped the battle against the Arab slave trade, shaped the struggles of modern day and the formation of modern day Tanzania. Zanzibar was a slave state run by an Arab minority against the interests of the black majority. People don't talk about that because it's difficult, it's embarrassing, it's complex. And so there is this tendency always to seek solace in simplification. And I think that's the importance of seminars such as this, isn't it?
Thank you. Peter.
I think it's simpler than that. I'm afraid that a lot of my fellow countrymen really always want to run things down. They find it that they like to take a critical view of almost everything. And you've only got to look at the newspapers every day to see that there's that kind of snide dislike of things which isn't particularly sensible, but it's a sort of characteristic of a great many of my fellow countrymen.
Yes, I take a couple more, here and then back.
On the question, Henry Frendo, on the question of Zimbabwe, I was there for UNHCR, and they repatriated thousands of Zimbabwean refugees from Mozambique and from Zambia and from Botswana. So I followed that election in May 1980 very carefully and was present for the independence celebrations. As Lord Carrington quite rightly said, the result of the election matched, person by person, the percentages of the tribes. So the Shonas and the Ndebellas. However, in succeeding elections, Robert Mugabe has succeeded in doing something which is rare in African history, and that was to undermine the loyalty of his own tribe. And that's what the MDC victory, in spite of all the harassment, has meant, that the selection of voters has gone beyond the tribal affiliation, which I see as a progressive development. Now, it's very complex, as you quite rightly say. It's difficult, it can be embarrassing. I don't come from a country which ever had an empire. I have no guilt to expiate. But I think there is a limit to political correctness, and sometimes it seems to me that going for the simple explanations is a tendency in that direction.
Thank you. Can we have one more from right at the back? And then I'll get Peter and Paul to answer.
Part of surely the legacy of empire should be saying thank you to the millions of troops who served a foreign, a lonely king and emperor who they really cannot have known anything about. My husband and my father both served in the South African Army. There was very little understanding by the native troops of what they were doing, and yet hundreds of thousands actually died in the war in Tanganyika. I believe it's estimated 250,000 bearers died in that campaign. And I do wonder if we ever really think about the millions who served us in India, in Pakistan, and all over the empire, how much we actually say thank you.
Thank you very much. Paul.
Well, thank you very much for that question, because I think it's just so true, and I think that's the importance of Srila Flather's Memorial Gates, and she deserves great credit for that. But also, I think we need to do a bit more work in hammering home the point that you have made. And let me just give you an example. There is a campaign currently in order to build a memorial at Spienkopf. because at Spienkopf you had the fascinating convergence of Botha, who was an Afrikaans general who was on that field during the Boer War. You had Winston Churchill, and you had Mahatma Gandhi as a ambulance stretcher bearer. You know, three great historical figures present at the same time during that particular conflict. So, and they're finding it very difficult to raise money for that memorial. And so I do think it's a worthwhile enterprise, just actually thinking about how we can do that. My own experience as a boy in the Agliombe Library in the Gold Coast, and it goes on to this day in the library. Every day they turn a page of the memorial book to show the names of the soldiers who died in the King's West African Rifles. The example from South Africa, we had just 6 years ago during my High Commissionership a very touching ceremony in the English Channel, supported by the Mayor and Corporation and folk here in the UK, of the sinking of the Mendi in the Channel. When, if you remember, the Zulus and the Xhosas went down together in that boat on their way in the First World War to the battlefield, singing hymns. And I do think it's worth hammering home this notion of Commonwealth and imperial interdependence, because the fact that people are and were united in sacrifice, that itself it says something about the human condition, and we don't want to lose sight of what we can learn from that in terms of future generations, I think. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Paul. Peter, would you like to comment? Can I bring us into tea time?